So this is a work that kind of spans 30 years between us. We grew up together in Rockford, Illinois, and there's a water tower over there that you can see, right next to like a sawtooth building there. And that's kind of how we grew up. We call it sort of the industrial Rust Belt. And my dad worked in a big factory. It was a grinding wheel factory. And so grinding wheel, they'd sell both the component and they would grind things like car parts, or they would sell you this big machine in which you put a grinder in and grind it whatever you needed to do with it. Anyway, very industrial kind of background. And my mom worked at a hospital and medical records and stuff. And so we've always been fascinated with art as a way of exploring our communities. And he started making art in the late 70s in high school, drawing and painting and conceptual art. And what I mean by conceptual art is you see a little bit of his work over here. And this, by the way, in the corner he made while waiting for me to teach last week. And he's like, give me some tape, give me a pen, give me a printer. And he sort of made this on the spot, all for you. So this is part of his conceptual work right there, where these are rejections of pieces he was working on. So he's kind of been working on these little poetic phrases. He wasn't happy with them. And so instead of throwing them away, he bundled them together to show you guys a little bit of his process and stuff. And I think what he ended up using is this one here, The River Spills What It No Longer Needs, and this one as well, Dance, Dance, Dance. And he was a dancer at one point. He danced on stage, and we grew up near a river, the Rock River, and it always flooded. And so our community, not necessarily our neighborhood, but the one next to us would flood quite often, and we'd see people's sheds float down the river and stuff. And we were sort of grew up mindful of all that. So we've always been about sort of how do we relate to you all our in a poetic way, ruminations on our sense of place and how we wander in the world. And what I talk about, if you're welcome to pick this up on our artist statement, is these liminal spaces, which are the spaces that are sort of in between and kind of often ignored or overlooked. And so that might be like a tire yard where you find, dozens and dozens and dozens of tires and stuff. It may be an abandoned train yard, and maybe a place where kids put their bicycles where they go to play. It could be derelict cinemas. It could be the broken shoreline in Maine. Not always. Some of these are still quite active, but the underside of a bridge. And so we try to take familiar places and make them feel slightly mysterious, slightly poetic, right? And slightly unknown, So something you might see every day, like the Fred Hartman Bridge, looks kind of cinematic. And I call it's the movie inside your head. And so take this place that you visit and you're like, you don't even think about it twice, but then I take a photo of it on a nice day that's kind of got clouds and maybe a little bit of drizzle, a little bit of rain, and it suddenly it feels like a movie. Because in my head, when I'm photographing, I'm thinking about 1930s movies. And so they're all in black and white and high contrast, and there's always a sense of mystery to it and stuff like that. I do a little bit of color, but not very often, partly because I'm not very technical, I'm not very trained, and so I can't always get the colors right. And so sometimes it happens like that Dallas Theater. I was just up there doing a talk with some famous musicians, and so that worked out perfectly, but a lot of times I have to go back to black and white because I feel like I have a little more control, a little more mastery, I have a little more understanding of the medium and stuff. And the other thing I think that's really important to me is that we've seen a generational shift over the last 20 years. So when I was growing up in the age of some of you students, we actually had a class called Industrial Arts. We learned how to do t-shirts, we learned how to do typeset. We learned how to do film back in those days. So you would actually have a camera, you would have the film, you would have the development to develop it, you had all the fluids and stuff like that. You had a darkroom and things like that. But over the last 20 years, that's entirely changed. You can still do that if you want, but most of us are using our phones. And so I don't know if this is going to surprise you, but about 90% of these shots were done on my phone. And I would say about a third of them are done out of my car. I didn't even leave my car to take some of these shots, like the Fred Hartman Bridge. And so what we're seeing is that that's a huge aesthetic change, right? You don't have to have fancy equipment. You don't have to have technical training. You don't have to have all this investment. It's about a commitment to a way of seeing the world. And so Lee Friedlander is one of my favorite photographers, and he always said, it's not the camera, it's the shot, right? And so you can do really interesting and poetic things with what you have on your hands, right? You don't have to go through specialized training. I didn't. I have absolutely no background in photography whatsoever, right? This is a process of self-discovery. You pick it up, you learn, you sort of do it yourself. So there's a certain kind of naivete to it. There's a sort of amateurish to it. There's a certain sort of imperfection to it. And I think that's okay, and that's fine, and that's sort of this human thing, and my brother's the same way. And so he incorporates a lot of found text and then throws his material on top of it. So he'll go to like a thrift store, and he'll get old diaries, he'll go get old music sheets, newspapers, whatever it may be, and then he paints on top of it and sort of explores it. Previously, he would do things like take family photographs, so he would go to like a flea market or go to a store, buy up old photographs, and then render them in deep, opaque black paint. And so they no longer look like a photograph, they look like something else, right? Like a biomorphic shape or a painting, or maybe even something that was medical or something like that. So he's always interested in like absence and presences and transformations, and again, making something familiar feel unfamiliar. And then over the last 10 years, he's been really into poetry, but kind of really shy about it, kind of uncertain of himself, not quite trusting his vision of things. And so these little phrases come up as he travels, and he's a bit more of a world traveler than I am. Obviously, he lives in Ecuador. And so these are like sort of these phrases that stick with him, and they're kind of musical and sort of exploration for him. There's a certain amount of innocence to it, so they're not very complicated phrases, obviously, like art saves, but I think deeply meaningful. Or I was looking for the moon, and it's sort of this idea of the quest. And then so we said, hey, you've been exploring with text, I've been exploring with photography, we've never put it together. He's done shows, I've done shows, but it's like, let's create a relationship between these. And we didn't do it beforehand. So we were offered the space, we pitched it and everything else, but when we came here, that's when we actually laid it out. So none of this was laid out previously, right? And so in the moment he decided, I think I want to juxtapose this text next to this photograph and go from there. So so sometimes they're obvious, like it's a honky tonk song, and that's Trophies, and Trophies is in Baytown where I teach, right? And so if you've never been to Trophies, it is lined with animals from top to bottom. Okay, so those antlers stretch the entire length of the building. There's giant bears, there are winged creatures all over the place, and obviously they probably do play honky tonk there. But in other places, it's completely more random, like, crumbs. Obviously, we think of food, but then we juxtapose it next to these used tires that I discovered. I took that 3 weeks ago, and that's on the South Loop on 610. And I just stumbled upon it after I dropped my wife off at work. I was like, wow, this is crazy. So what do we do with abandoned tires? And it's like, well, this is kind of what we do. And so there's this set of inferences, but they're not like literal, and they're not like one-to-one. They're sort of suggestive, and they're sort of poetic, and sometimes they connect more meaningfully than others. Sometimes they can feel a little bit random and whatnot. And I have this love of nature, but not necessarily, I'm not very good in technical, like taking pictures of birds or animals or whatnot. So I like a little more immersive quality. And I like, like over here, this is Rice University. And down here is the coast of Maine. And these are sort of these natural spaces that have been inhabited now by these huge industrial infrastructure. So that's the underside of 330 that goes around Baytown? I'm trying to think all of a sudden. So this is the underside of it, and people fish there, and some people live there sometimes and whatnot. And so I want to see, how does the natural world interact with these huge industrial infrastructures and stuff, and still retain a place where you can meditate, or you could be thoughtful, where you can sort of reflect, even though it's like there's this huge traffic up above you and the whole thing is kind of shaking, and it feels like you're in an earthquake, literally. And then over here, this is Taos. And so if anybody who's been in New Mexico, I went to school in Santa Fe for a while, and you'll see these incredible adobe structures. That happens to be a church. But if you go to the Taos, I think of what's it called all of a sudden? The Pueblo. Thank you, my wife. You'll see structures like that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and how they sort of integrate with that natural environment in a very, in a way that's non-intrusive, right, compared to like this huge industrial material, right? And so I wanted to like pay attention to the way that shapes and landscapes, both man-made, artificial, ancient, contemporary, all sort of work together and everything. And then the graffiti, and I'm not interested in like pure graffiti very much, like, you know, like people tagging and whatnot, or big fat stuff you see on trains and things like that, but how graffiti erodes over time. And so what's interesting to me about graffiti is that as soon as they apply it to what we call these contested spaces, right? And so you got these official posters, and those posters are ripped down, and then somebody tags it, and eventually those deteriorate as well. So there's this built-in process over time where you see something crumble, and you see something deteriorate, and you see something wear out. And to me, that's sort of this interesting, beautiful thing as a folklorist, right? Kind of like graffiti. And sometimes it's illegal, sometimes it is sanctioned, and you know all that. Like over here, we have the sign in New Orleans. And sort of the classic mint julep, and it reminds me of the South, right? But then obviously people have come in and tagged it. And so you have this commercial language mixed with this very private language, which might be rebellious or just seeking fun or just seeking attention to stuff like that. And they combine in that around these spaces in which thousands of people go to every day, right? And then the residents probably have very mixed feelings about it and whatnot. So that's just a little bit of an overview. I'm sorry to not have my brother here to explain his process a little bit more. And we do have these takeaways, right, that you can give it this artist overview. And I also brought some of my books that you're welcome to look at too, and you can kind of see the literary side of me as well. But are there any questions I can entertain or answer or discuss? Anything you want to point out at all? Any other questions? Well, we still have plenty of food. I would love to talk to you one-on-one. Please take an artist statement on your way out. I really thank you for being here. Thank the college for being so supportive, doing so many great things. They've been working on the Instagram accounts. They worked hard. Eden's done an incredible job of doing the install. He actually thought of the driftwood, by the way, which is brilliant. Because we were having this discussion, like, I want this photo to be part of the show. My brother was opposed. I think, what did we say? We were going to use a easel, right? And he's like, I don't want an easel. So I said, I gave him a task, which is, hey, could you somehow mount it without an easel? And he came up with the driftwood, which I think worked perfectly. So I really appreciate that. And it's been an incredible experience here. So please ask me anything to continue to look around and eat some food and enjoy.